My name is Renata June Holloway. I am 37 years old, and my brother-in-law spent 9 years stealing from my father while my father was still alive to watch it happen. I want to start with the ledger. I have to start with the ledger because everything else I am about to tell you will make more sense if you understand what that ledger meant to my father. Not what it meant to me, not what it meant to a courtroom, what it meant to him. My father, Gerald Holloway, kept records the way other men kept rosary beads. He was not a religious man. He was a man who believed that the truth of a life was in its numbers. What came in, what went out, what was promised, and what was paid. He had 3 ledgers by the time he retired from the mill in 2009. Green cover, the first one, blue cover, the second. The third one, the one he started in 2011, had a brown cover the color of creek mud, and his name was written inside the front flap in his own handwriting. Gerald A. Holloway, Steubenville, Ohio. He underlined it twice. He gave me that third ledger in January of 2021, 2 days before he died. He pressed it into my hands and did not say anything for a long time. I was sitting in the chair beside his hospital bed at Trinity Medical Center on Sunset Boulevard, and the heating vent above the window was making a sound like a spoon in a garbage disposal, and I was thinking about how I needed to ask the nurse if they could fix it because Dad had always been a light sleeper and that sound was going to keep him up. He said, "Renata, you do the maths." That was all. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I need to go back. I always have to go back with this story. There is no way to tell it straight through without losing something important, and the thing I most do not want to lose is the way it actually felt to live through it. Not the version I have told lawyers, not the version I have told my sister, the version that is true in the places that do not have names. I am a forensic bookkeeper. I have been one since 2012. Before that, I was a staff accountant at a firm in Pittsburgh, and before that, I was a girl in Steubenville, Ohio, who used to sit at her father's elbow every Sunday morning while he went through the household books at the kitchen table. He would hand me the pencil and say, "Add that column," and I would add it, and if it was wrong, he would tap the paper with one finger and wait for me to find the error. He never told me where the error was, he just waited. That is how I learned patience and arithmetic at the same time, and I have never been able to fully separate the two. My sister Pauline is 3 years older than me. She married Dale Rickers in 2004 at St. Peter's on Adams Street, and I was her maid of honor, and I wore a dress the color of old celery that she picked out from a catalog, and I wore it with a smile because she was my sister and I loved her. Dale was 31 at the time of the wedding. He worked in sales, pharmaceutical equipment, and he had a way of explaining things to people that made them feel like they had just been given a gift when in fact they had been given exactly what they already had before. My father called it charm. My mother called it a good personality. I called it the way his eyes went a little flat when he thought no one was watching. I want to be fair, for the first few years I did not have a specific reason not to trust Dale. He was attentive to Pauline, he showed up to family dinners. He helped my father move furniture when they redecorated the living room in 2007. He told jokes at Christmas. He drove my mother to a doctor's appointment once when her car was in the shop and I was out of town for work. These are not the actions of a cartoon villain. I need you to understand that because if you imagine him as obviously terrible from the beginning, then the story I am about to tell you will not make sense. The story only makes sense if you understand that he was ordinary enough, for long enough, that no one thought to look. My father had a pension from the mill. He had a small investment account he had been contributing to since 1978. He had the house on Maple Ridge Drive paid off as of 2004. And he had a joint savings account at First National Bank of Steubenville that he had opened with my mother in 1981, the year I was born, the year they bought the house. My mother died in 2013. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she died, my father sat at the kitchen table for 3 days and did not eat and did not sleep, and on the fourth day he got up, made himself a pot of coffee, and started a new column in the ledger. That is the kind of man he was. What I did not know in 2013, what none of us knew, was that Dale had been in that joint savings account since 2012. I need to sit with that for a second. 2012. My mother was still alive in 2012. She was sick, she had been sick for several months by then, and my father was overwhelmed in the way that people become overwhelmed when the person they have loved for 40 years starts to leave them incrementally. Dale had offered to help with finances. He had framed it as a kindness. He had sat at that same kitchen table where my father taught me to add columns, and he had said, "Gerald, you've got enough on your plate. Let me take some of this off you." And my father, who was 71 years old and watching his wife die and had never once in his life asked for help he did not have to ask for, said yes. I did not know this for 8 years. There are things I knew and things I suspected and things I chose not to examine too closely, and I want to be honest about which was which. I knew that Dale handled some of my father's accounts after my mother died. Dad had mentioned it once in passing at Easter dinner in 2014. He said Dale has been helping me sort through some of the financial stuff, and Pauline said, "Oh, that's wonderful, isn't it?" And I said yes, and then we talked about something else. That was the extent of it. One sentence at Easter dinner. I filed it in the part of my brain labeled family business that is not your business, and I did not open that file for a very long time. What I suspected, and I mean suspected the way you suspect a smell that you cannot quite identify, was that something was off in my father's life in a way that I could not articulate. He did not seem to be struggling exactly. He had money for groceries, for his prescriptions, for the gas bill, but there was something tight in the way he talked about money that had not been there before. He had always been careful with money, but carefulness looks a certain way and worry looks a different way. And by 2016, I thought I was seeing worry. And I did not know what to do with that because my father had never admitted to a financial problem in his life, and he was not going to start at 74. I did nothing, I want to say that clearly. I noticed something and I did nothing. I can tell you why, or I can tell you what I told myself, which is not the same thing. What I told myself was that it was not my place, that my father was a grown man who had managed his own life for 7 decades, that if he needed help he would ask. What the truth probably is, somewhere underneath that, is that looking closely at my father's finances meant having a conversation with Dale, and having a direct conversation with Dale meant a conversation with Pauline, and Pauline had been through enough. She had miscarried twice by 2016. She was worn thin in ways I could see but did not know how to touch. I chose her peace over my suspicion, and I lived with that choice for 5 years. There was a Thursday in October of 2018 that I keep coming back to. I had driven down from Pittsburgh for my father's 77th birthday. Just a small dinner, the four of us, Dad's friend Herb from the mill and Herb's wife Dottie. Dad made his pot roast. Dottie brought a German chocolate cake. Dale opened a bottle of wine and poured glasses for everyone and made a toast that was technically about my father but was structured in such a way that Dale himself came up 3 times before the end of it. I watched my father smile during the toast the way people smile when they have decided in advance to smile. After dinner, Herb and Dottie left early because Dottie had a bad knee and was tired. Pauline started washing dishes. Dale went to use the bathroom, and my father and I were alone at the table for maybe 4 minutes. He said, "How's work?" I said, "Good, busy. We just finished a case in Allegheny County that I cannot talk about, but it went the way it should have." He nodded, he turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. He said, "You're good at what you do, Renata." I said, "I learned from you." He turned the cup again, he said, "I mean it, you're good at seeing things." I did not know what to do with that. I said, "Thank you." Pauline came back in from the kitchen and asked if anyone wanted more cake, and my father said yes, he would have a sliver, and that was the end of it. I drove back to Pittsburgh that night and I thought about what he had said for maybe 20 minutes on the highway, and then I let it go. He was trying to tell me something. I understand that now. He had been trying for longer than I knew. But he was Gerald Holloway from Steubenville, Ohio, and the vocabulary for asking his daughter to look at his finances was a vocabulary he did not have and could not build, and so instead he told me I was good at seeing things and turned his coffee cup in a circle. And hoped I would put it together. I did not put it together for another 2 years. It was not until January of 2020 that I started looking. And I started looking not because I had some intuition or some dramatic revelation. I started looking because my father called me on a Tuesday night to ask if he could borrow $300. He had never in his life asked me for money. He had given it. He had cosigned a loan for my first car. He had put a check in my birthday card every year until I was 30, and then he switched to gift cards because he thought that was more appropriate for an adult daughter, which always made me a little sad, but that is beside the point. He had never asked me for money, not once. And when I heard those words come out of his mouth, $300, Renata, just until the end of the month, something in my chest went very still. Not cold exactly. Still. The way a room goes still when someone in it has said the wrong thing and everyone is waiting to see what happens next. I said, "Dad, of course." I sent it that night through Zelle. And then I sat at my kitchen table in Pittsburgh with my laptop open and I started thinking about what I knew. I knew he had a pension, I knew the house was paid off. I knew the property taxes on a house like that in Jefferson County were manageable. His prescriptions were covered by Medicare, he did not travel, he did not spend extravagantly. There was no reason on paper for Gerald Holloway to be $300 short at the end of January. I did not call Pauline, I did not call Dale. I went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours and then I got up and wrote myself a note that said, "Ask Dad to show you the account statements," and I left it on my kitchen counter and went back to bed. I should tell you what forensic bookkeeping actually is because it matters here. Forensic bookkeeping is the practice of reconstructing financial records, identifying discrepancies, tracing the movement of money, and documenting what happened in a form that is legally admissible. I do it for attorneys mostly, sometimes for businesses that suspect internal theft, sometimes for estates where the heirs cannot agree on where the money went. I have sat across from a lot of people over the years who looked me in the eye and told me a story about money that was not true, and I have learned to tell the difference between a person who is lying and a person who has simply convinced themselves of something that is not accurate because those two people require different approaches. When I went back to Steubenville in February of 2020, 3 weeks after the phone call, I told my father I was coming for a long weekend. I did not tell him why. He made chicken soup and we watched an Ohio State game and I slept in my old bedroom with the window cracked because I still cannot sleep without cold air. On the second day, a Saturday, I waited until after lunch and then I said, "Dad, I want to understand your finances better. Will you walk me through things with me?" He looked at me for a long time. His eyes are brown, the same brown as mine, and they do not give much away. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I want to make sure you're okay." He said, "I'm okay." I said, "I know, but I'd like to see." Another long pause. He went to the kitchen and came back with the brown ledger. He set it on the coffee table between us, and then he sat down in his chair and he did not look at it. He looked at me. I opened it. There are moments in work, in real forensic work, where you open a document and within the first 30 seconds you know that something is wrong. It is not a feeling exactly. It is more like a recognition, the same way you can tell when a column of numbers is not going to add up before you have finished reading it. Something in the pattern is already off. I had that recognition within 60 seconds of opening my father's ledger. The numbers were not catastrophically wrong. That is important. If they had been catastrophically wrong, I would have seen it sooner. He would have seen it sooner. Someone would have said something. They were wrong in the way that a slow leak is wrong. Gradual, consistent, patterned in a way that was designed to look like ordinary fluctuation if you were not trained to look for design. I did not say anything that afternoon. I sat with the ledger for 2 hours, asking my father questions in a voice I have spent 15 years learning to keep even. When did you open the account with Dale on it? What does this withdrawal correspond to? Who manages the automatic transfers? Do you have the bank statements from the past 3 years? He answered all of it, quietly, the way people answer when they are both hoping to be believed and hoping to be wrong. I took photos of every page of the ledger with my phone before I left. I also asked my father to authorize me as a contact on his accounts at First National, which he did the following Monday by phone with me on the line. He added my name. He did not tell Dale. I drove back to Pittsburgh on Sunday evening and I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 12 minutes before I went inside. I was not ready to be in my apartment yet. I needed the car around me for a little while. I needed the specific feeling of being enclosed in something that had no expectations of me. My stomach had been in a low-grade knot since Saturday afternoon and it did not loosen until much later. Weeks later, months. I pulled the bank statements the following week. I had access now legally and I pulled them all. 3 years was what I had asked for as a starting point. What I got back confirmed what the ledger had suggested and then exceeded it in ways I had not anticipated. There was a pattern of withdrawals from the joint savings account, my father's account, that had been occurring since 2012. Regular, not identical amounts which would have been too obvious. They ranged between $400 and $1,200, spaced between 3 and 6 weeks apart, never with a consistent enough interval to create a visible rhythm if you were only glancing. But I was not glancing, I was reading. Over 8 years, from 2012 to 2020, the total when I finished my initial calculation was $61,430. I sat with that number for a long time. $61,430. My father's money. taken in increments small enough to stay beneath the threshold of obvious alarm, taken while my mother was dying and while my father was grieving and while Pauline was struggling and while I was in Pittsburgh not looking close enough. I did not cry. I want to say that I did, and that it would be understandable and human and correct to cry at a moment like that. My eyes went hot for about 15 seconds, and then something behind my sternum went hard, and I picked up my pen and I kept working. This is the part I need to explain carefully, because it is the part people get wrong when they imagine what you do with information like that. You do not confront, not first, not if you want the truth preserved in a form that will actually matter. If I had called Dale that night, if I had called Pauline that night, if I had said I know what you did, the first thing that happens is the evidence starts to move, accounts get closed, records get requested and then somehow become unavailable. Conversations happen that I am not part of, and all of that is much harder to undo than people think, even when you are dealing with records at a federally regulated financial institution. Not impossible, but harder, and I did not want harder, I wanted clean. So I did not say anything to anyone except my father, and what I said to my father was, I see it. I am going to need more time. Do not let Dale know I have access to the accounts. My father looked at me the way he used to look at me when I found the error in the column, like I had done the thing he needed me to do and he could put the pencil down now. He said, okay. That was January of 2020. What happened next, I am going to tell you the way it actually happened, which is slowly. I went back to Steubenville once a month from February to December of 2020. Pandemic made this complicated, but I drove, always drove, never flew. I would arrive on a Friday evening and leave on a Sunday. My father and I did not discuss the investigation every visit. We watched television. I helped him clean out the garage in June. I made his mother's pierogi recipe in August because he had been talking about it. We ate them at the kitchen table with sour cream, and he said mine were close but not quite, and that is the highest compliment Gerald Holloway ever gave anyone's cooking, so I took it. But on one afternoon of each visit, usually a Saturday, we would sit at the table together and I would bring out what I had found that month and we would go through it. He began recognizing the pattern before I had to explain it to him. He had a bookkeeper's brain too, underneath the grief and the age and the years of trusting the wrong person. By April, he was finishing my sentences. By June, he had remembered things about specific withdrawals that he had not thought about in years, that he had assigned to normal variance and forgotten, that now made sense in a different way. I want to be careful here about what my father felt during these months, because I only know what he showed me, and he was a man who had spent 70 years deciding exactly what to show. He was not dramatic about it, he did not rage, he did not break down. He sat at his table with his coffee and he looked at the numbers, and sometimes he would be quiet for a long time and then he would say, and this one here, and I would tell him what that one was, and he would nod, just nod, and turn his coffee cup in that slow circle. Once in September, after we had established that the total was closer to 63,000 than 61, because I had found a category of transfers I had initially miscategorized, he said, do you know how long it takes to save $63,000 when you work at a mill? I said I did know. He said 31 years. He said it without any particular heat, just information, the way he said everything. I had to look out the window for a while after that. By December of 2020, I had a complete reconstruction, 47 distinct transactions over 107 months. I had the bank records, I had the ledger photographs, I had my father's testimony, documented in a form I had been careful to make legally usable. I had contacted a lawyer in Pittsburgh, a woman named Sandra Cho at Cho and Merritt on Fifth Avenue, who specializes in financial elder abuse cases and who had been waiting for me to tell her I was ready. I was ready in December. And then my father had a stroke. December 18th, 2020. He was at home. He had gone to bed the night before and woke up and could not move the left side of his face and could not pick up the phone on his nightstand, and he lay there for 2 hours before a neighbor, Marvy Seltzer from next door, came to check on him because his car had not moved and his lights had not come on, and Marvy had been watching without him knowing she was watching, which is its own quiet grace, and I will not forget it. He was at Trinity Medical Center for 3 weeks. He came home in January. He was not the same after that. He walked more slowly. He tired more easily. The left side of his face never fully came back, but his eyes were the same and his hands were the same, and he knew what the ledger was when I put it in his hands in his hospital room, and he held it against his chest for a while before he gave it back to me. He died January 23rd, 2021, peacefully, the nurses said, and I believe them. The funeral was at Zimmer's on Market Street. There were maybe 60 people, which was more than I had expected but less than he deserved. Dale cried in the front row beside Pauline. I watched him cry the way I watch a document that does not add up, with complete attention and no expression. Pauline held his hand. She has held his hand at every family event for 17 years, and I do not know what to do with that except to note it and keep going. Sandra Cho filed the civil complaint in March of 2021. I want to tell you what it felt like to see the complaint in its final form, because I had spent more than a year building toward that document, and I thought I knew what it would feel like to see it finished, and I was wrong about that. It is 23 pages. It names Dale Rickers as the respondent. It lays out in chronological order every transaction I had identified, every account, every date, every dollar amount. It uses the phrase financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult 47 times. It asks for full restitution of $63,215 plus interest, plus attorney fees, plus damages under Ohio's elder abuse statutes. I read it twice at Sandra's conference table on Fifth Avenue, and then I folded my hands on top of it, and I looked at the view of the Allegheny through her window, and my shoulders came down about 2 inches, and I did not realize until that moment how long I had been holding them up. Sandra said, "Are you ready for this to get uncomfortable?" I said, "It has been uncomfortable for a long time already." She nodded. She had the kind of face that does not offer comfort unnecessarily, which I appreciated. I have to tell you now about Pauline, because you have been waiting for that part and so have I. I told her the night before Sandra filed. I drove to Steubenville and I knocked on the door of the house on Maplewood, the house she and Dale had bought in 2008, the house my father had helped them with the down payment on, $3,000. I found that in the ledger too. I knocked on the door, and when she answered I said, "I need to talk to you alone. Can Dale go somewhere for an hour?" She looked at me, she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I need an hour with you alone, Pauline's." She had Dale go to the store, she made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table. She was wearing a gray cardigan that she has had since at least 2015, and she kept pulling the sleeve down over her left hand, which is something she does when she is nervous, which I have been watching her do for decades and which still goes straight to the center of my chest when I see it. I told her everything. I started with the phone call in January 2020 and I went through it in order. I had printed a summary document, 5 pages, Sandra had helped me put it together in plain language. I slid it across the table to her the way you slide something across a table when you know it is going to change everything and you have run out of ways to prepare the person. She read the first page, then the second. I watched her face the way I have watched documents and account statements for 15 years, looking for the moment of comprehension. It came on the third page. Her face went very still and her left hand came up and pressed flat against her sternum, and she did not breathe for about 4 seconds. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since February of last year. I didn't tell you until now because I needed the evidence complete before anything could happen that would disturb it." She looked at me, she said, "You've been sitting on this for a year." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you came to me the night before you file." I said, "Yes." She looked back at the papers. She turned to page 4. She said the number out loud, $63,215. She said it quietly, like she was reading it to herself, like she needed to hear what it sounded like in a human voice. There was a long silence. Outside, a truck went past on the street. A dog somewhere in the neighborhood barked twice and then stopped. She said, "Does this mean you think I knew?" I said, "No, I don't think you knew." She said, "Because I didn't." I said, "I believe you." She put her hands flat on the table. She had been crying without making any noise, and I had not noticed until that moment. I had been watching the papers and not her face. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and she looked at the sleeve of her cardigan and she said, "He helped Dad with the down payment on this house." I said, "I know." She said, $3,000. I said, "I know." She nodded. She did not say anything else for a while. She picked up the papers again and read to the end. When she finished, she set them down and she looked at the refrigerator, which has a photo on it of her and Dale at somebody's wedding, laughing, both of them with their heads thrown back. She said, "Okay." That was all she said, "Okay." And she picked up her coffee cup and held it with both hands and looked at the window, and I sat across from her and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was better than silence, and I have learned in this work and in this family that sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stay quiet and let the room hold what it is holding. Dale hired a lawyer. Of course he did. The lawyer's name was Brendan Kerr, and he had an office in Weirton, and he filed a response in April 2021 that denied everything and characterized my documentation as speculative, and claimed that my father had voluntarily authorized all transfers and that Dale had been providing compensated financial management services under a private agreement. I want to tell you about that claim because it made me set my pen down on my legal pad very slowly and stare at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. A private agreement for financial management services compensated. There was no such agreement in writing. There was no record of any payment to Dale for any management service at any point. There was no mention of such an arrangement in my father's ledger, which documented every financial transaction in his life for 30 years. There was no tax record of Dale reporting such income. There was nothing. The claim was a piece of paper that said, "Trust me," instead of the math. I have spent my career encountering that claim in various forms. In my experience, it rarely survives contact with actual documents. Brendan Kerr filed a motion to dismiss in May. Sandra filed our opposition in June. She included the complete forensic reconstruction, 411 pages, with every transaction cross-referenced to its corresponding bank record. She included the ledger photographs. She included my father's sworn statement, which we had recorded and notarized in November of 2020, 2 months before his stroke. She included a chain of custody document establishing the integrity of every piece of evidence. The motion to dismiss was denied in August 2021. Discovery began in September. I was deposed in October. The deposition lasted 6 hours. Brendan Kerr asked me questions about my methodology for 3 hours, and then shifted to questions about my relationship with my father, and then to questions about whether I had any financial motive in the case, to which the answer was no. I stood to receive nothing from any settlement because I was not a named party in the estate dispute. I was acting as a forensic witness and a concerned daughter, both of which were true. He asked me at one point whether I had coached my father in the statements he made. I said no. He asked whether I had selectively chosen which transactions to include in my reconstruction. I said no, and I explained for the fourth time that my reconstruction methodology was complete, not selective, and that I could walk him through it again if that would be helpful. I said it pleasantly. I have been in enough depositions to know that pleasant is the correct register in a deposition, even when the question is designed to be insulting. My hands were flat on the table the entire 6 hours. I did not move them except to occasionally pick up the glass of water in front of me. When Brendan Kerr finished, I thanked him for his time, which I meant, because a 6-hour deposition in which I got to explain my methodology in detail to opposing counsel is actually a good day when you believe your methodology is correct. The mediation was in February 2022. A Friday, Sandra and I drove to Columbus together. Brendan Kerr and Dale were already in the building when we arrived, in a separate room, which is how mediations work. The mediator was a woman named Carol Atkins, gray hair, comfortable shoes, and office full of plants. She came to our room first and explained the process, which Sandra and I already knew, but I listened carefully because Carol Atkins was not performing the explanation. She was genuinely running through it, which told me something about how she conducted her work. We made our opening demand: full restitution of $63,215, attorney fees, which by February of 2022 were $18,400, damages under Ohio's revised code Chapter 2307 Elder Abuse Statute. We were asking for $104,000. Dale's first counteroffer was $20,000, a lump sum, no admission of wrongdoing. Carol Atkins carried it to us with no expression. She set it on the table and looked at us. I said no. Sandra said, "We'll counter at 95. We went back and forth 4 times. By 3 in the afternoon, we were at $68,000. By 4:30, we were at $74,000. Dale was in the other room with his lawyer, and presumably with the understanding that a trial was the alternative to a settlement, and a trial with 411 pages of forensic documentation and a deceased man's notarized statement was an alternative he was going to want to think very carefully about. At 5:47 in the afternoon, Carol Atkins came into room and set a number on the tables. $81,600, full settlement, structured payment over 36 months, no admission of wrongdoing in the settlement language, which we knew we would not get and had already decided was not the hill we needed. Sandra looked at me. I looked at the number for about 15 seconds, then I said yes. The settlement was signed in March 2022. First payment came in April. I set up an account in Pauline's name and transferred the first payment into it the day it arrived, because the money was my father's, and when your father is gone, the next of kin is your sister, and I am not interested in keeping what does not belong to me. Pauline and I have had two real conversations since February 2021, not the logistical kind, not the text messages about the estate, not the brief exchanges at the lawyer's office. Two real conversations. The first was in May of 2021. She called me on a Tuesday evening and said, I filed. I said, okay. She said, it'll be finalized in 6 months probably. I said, are you okay? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I keep thinking about Dad at that birthday dinner, the one in 2018. Do you remember? I said, I remembered. She said, he knew, didn't he? He knew for a long time. I said, I think he was trying to figure out how to tell us without blowing everything up. She said he was protecting me. I said, probably. Another long silence. She said, I keep adding up how many years he sat with that alone. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. She knew the number. She could do the math herself. The second real conversation was in October of 2022. We met at the house on Maple Ridge Drive, my father's house, which is being prepared for sale now that the estate is settled. We walked through the rooms without saying much. The kitchen where we did arithmetic on Sunday mornings. The hallway where our school photos hung in a row until my mother repainted. The back bedroom that was mine until Pauline took it when she was 12 and I was 9, and it caused a war that lasted 3 weeks and ended with my mother threatening to redecorate both rooms in pink. We stood in the kitchen for a while. Pauline said, what are you going to keep? I said, the ledgers. She looked at me. She said, all three of them. I said, all three. She nodded. She reached over and touched the handle of the kitchen faucet, which has a slow drip that Dad never fixed because he said the sound of it was company. She said, he was right about you, about seeing things. I said, I know. She said, I'm not mad at you. I want you to know that. I'm mad, but not at you. I said, I know. She turned the faucet on and then off. The drip resumed. We stood there in the kitchen of that house for a few more minutes and then we went outside and locked up. Have you ever been the person in your family who saw something clearly for a long time before anyone else was ready to see it too? Have you ever stayed quiet because the timing wasn't right, because the evidence wasn't complete, because the people you loved needed to be protected from what you knew until you could protect them properly? I'd like to know if that's a familiar feeling. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. I want to tell you where the ledger is now. I drove back to Pittsburgh from Steubenville after we locked up the house. It was a Sunday in October, early evening. The Ohio River Bridge lit up the way it does in the fall when the water is high and the light is going sideways. I have driven that stretch of Route 22 more times than I can count. I know every curve of it. I know where the guardrail is bent from the accident in 2019. I know the billboard for the personal injury lawyer that has been there since before I had a driver's license. I had the 3 ledgers in a canvas bag on the back seat. When I got home, I put them on my desk. Green cover, blue cover, brown cover, Gerald A. Holloway, Steubenville, Ohio. The underline still holds. The ink on it has not faded. I open the brown one sometimes, not often, but sometimes on a Sunday morning when the apartment is quiet. I read a column. I add the numbers. I find the errors he marked with a small penciled check, the errors from years before I was looking, the entries where something did not add up and he noted it and kept going because he did not yet have the right person to hand the pencil to. He kept records the way other men kept rosary beads. I understand that now in a way I did not when he was alive. He was not keeping records for the pleasure of accuracy, though I think he had that pleasure. He was keeping records because he believed that the truth of a life was in its numbers, and he believed that truth was worth preserving, and he believed that someday someone patient enough and careful enough would sit down and do the math. He was right. He just had to wait a long time for me to figure out that he meant me. The brown ledger sits on my desk in Pittsburgh between a cup of pens and a photograph of my parents at the county fair in 1986. My mother is laughing at something outside the frame. My father is looking at her. I look at it every morning when I sit down to work. Then I open my files and I start counting. I have not told you everything about Dale yet. I want to be fair to the shape of the story, which means I need to tell you some things that made the whole thing harder than it sounds when I summarize it the way I just did. Dale Rickers was not cruel in the way that is easy to identify. I have known cruel people. I have sat across from them in depositions. I have read their fingerprints in altered documents. Cruelty that announces itself is not actually the most dangerous kind. The most dangerous kind is the cruelty that presents as reason, that presents as practicality, that says I am not doing anything wrong, I am doing what makes sense, look at the situation clearly and you will see. That was Dale. He had a way of making his accounting of a situation feel like the only honest accounting. He was not loud about it, he was patient about it. He would let you finish talking and then he would say, I hear you, but and then he would explain things in a way that sounded so measured and so grounded that you sometimes walked away from the conversation wondering if you had been confused all along. I watched him do this to my father over years of Sunday dinners, not on any single big thing, on small things. What the driveway repair was going to cost, whether the second car was still worth keeping, whether the gutters needed replacing this year or could wait. My father would raise a number and Dale would have a different number, and somehow by the end of the conversation, my father's number had become the unrealistic one. I watched it happen. I did not have the language for it until later. The language is financial gaslighting, which is a phrase I have used in legal documents, but which here I am using as a description of what it felt like to watch from the outside. I want to be clear, I am not a person who uses therapeutic language carelessly. I have strong feelings about precision in language, but financial gaslighting is actually a precise term for a specific thing, which is the deliberate manipulation of another person's understanding of their own financial situation in order to make them doubt their own judgment. And that is what Dale did to my father, consistently over years, in the space created by my father's grief and age and trust. He had access to the account, he had my father's trust, he had the patience to move slowly enough that nothing looked sudden, and he had the social presentation of a reasonable man, which is the most effective cover available. I have thought a lot about the moment he decided to start. The first transaction in the account was in April of 2012. My mother had been diagnosed in November of 2011, so the timeline is diagnosis, then 5 months, then the first withdrawal. I do not know exactly what Dale was thinking in those 5 months. I do not know at what point he looked at the situation and saw not his father-in-law struggling but an opportunity that was about to become available. I do not know if he told himself a story about being owed something, about the time he spent helping with finances deserving compensation, about my father having more than he needed and it being reasonable to redistribute some of it. People tell themselves a lot of stories. I have seen the stories people tell in the documents they leave behind. What I know is that the first withdrawal was $480, and it was on a Thursday in April. And my mother was in her second round of chemotherapy, and my father was 71 years old and frightened in the specific way of a man who has never before in his life considered what it would mean to be alone. $480 on a Thursday. I know that amount by heart. I know all 47 amounts by heart. This is not a skill I cultivated deliberately. It is what happens when you spend a year and a half reconstructing a record. The numbers become part of you the way a song becomes part of you when you hear it enough times. You do not choose to remember it, it is simply there. The last transaction was December of 2019, $720, 14 days before my father called me and asked to borrow $300. I want to stay on the December 2019 transaction for a moment because of what it tells me about Dale's state of mind. By December of 2019, he had been doing this for 7 years and 4 months. He had never been caught, he had never been questioned, not in any direct way, not in any way he had to take seriously. He had every reason to believe that the system he had built was stable and would continue. And in that context, 3 weeks before Christmas, he took $720 from a 78-year-old widower who then had to call his daughter for $300 to get through January. I think about that a lot, not because it changes the dollar amount, not because it changes the legal situation, but because it tells me something about the relationship between impunity and escalation. When nothing bad happens, when no one is looking, when the system keeps working, the amounts go up. Not always dramatically, sometimes incrementally, but they go up because why wouldn't they? The $720 tells me that by December of 2019, Dale was comfortable. I do not say this with satisfaction, I say it because it is accurate. Now I want to tell you about Herbs. Herb Kolsar was my father's friend from the mill. They had worked together for 22 years from 1975 to 1997. They were not demonstrative men. They did not call each other on the phone and have long conversations, but they showed up for each other in the specific ways that working men of that generation show up for each other, which is to say, reliably, practically, without a lot of commentary. Herb came to my father's birthday every year. He came to my mother's funeral. He came to the hospital twice during the stroke recovery. He sat in the waiting room at Trinity Medical Center for 4 hours on the day of the worst scan and did not tell anyone he was there until it was over. What I did not know until after my father died is that Herb had noticed something in 2017. He told me at the funeral. We were standing outside Zimmer's during the reception, in the parking lot in January cold, both of us with our coats wrapped tight. He had a cup of coffee and he held it with both hands the way my father always held his coffee, and for a second I had to look away. He said, "There's something I should have said to you sooner." I said, "Okay." He said, "A while back, couple years ago maybe, I had coffee with Gerald at that diner on 4th. We used to go on the second Tuesday of the month mostly. He seemed off. I asked him how things were with the money stuff because Dottie. And I had been a little worried. You see him and you see a man who's been careful his whole life and now something's not adding up in his face. You understand?" I said I understood. He said he didn't say anything specific. He's Gerald, you know. But he said something like, "Dale's been a big help with the accounts," and the way he said it, I don't know the way he said it. He looked at his coffee. He said, "I should have asked you then. I'm sorry I didn't." I said, "Herb, you came to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without telling anyone." He looked at me. I said, "You showed up. That's what you did. You showed up the way you could." He nodded. He looked at the parking lot. He said he was a good man. I said he was. We stood there for another minute in the cold, then we went back inside. I have thought about Herb's Tuesday coffee with my father a lot since then. I think about the way my father apparently said Dale's been a big help in a tone that was not exactly the tone of a man who felt helped. I think about how many times the people around us know something is wrong before we have found the words for what is wrong, how many times people sit across from each other at diner tables and sense that something is off and do not know how to ask the right question, and how much that silence costs. I am not blaming Herb. Herb loved my father and did what he knew how to do. I am not even blaming myself, though I have tried. I spent a fair amount of time in 2020 trying to figure out exactly how early I could have started looking if I had been paying closer attention, and the answer is probably 2016 or 2017, and that answer sat badly with me for a long time. It still sits badly with me. But sitting badly with something and being destroyed by it are two different things, and I chose the former. What I did with it eventually was this: I let it make me a better forensic bookkeeper. I think about Herb's Tuesday coffees now when I am working a case. I think about the moments that passed before someone started documenting. I try to be the person who starts the documentation sooner. I cannot fix the past. I can build a better habit in the present. I also want to tell you about Sandra Cho's paralegal, whose name was Marcus Webb and who deserves more credit than he will probably ever receive. Marcus handled a large portion of the document management for our case. He was 26 years old. Methodical in a way that pleased me, and he had the specific competence of someone who does invisible work very well and does not need to be recognized for it. He organized the 411 pages of our evidence file in a way that made the deposition possible. He prepared the cross-reference index that allowed Sandra to navigate 47 transactions in real time during mediation without losing her place. He caught an error in my initial reconstruction in August of 2021, a miscategorized transfer from November of 2015 that I had assigned to the wrong account period, which changed the total by $45, but which mattered because accuracy was the whole argument. He sent me an email about the error at 8:30 in the evening on a Tuesday. The subject line was just November 2015 transaction. The body of the email was 4 sentences explaining the discrepancy and the correct categorization. No apology for the late hour, no hedging, just the information. I sent back, "Thank you, you're right, corrected in the files." He sent back, "Okay." That was the whole exchange. That is what it looks like when two people take accuracy seriously. I have thought about that exchange more than you would expect. Let me tell you about the day the first settlement payment arrived. It was a Wednesday in April 2022. I was at my desk in Pittsburgh when the notification came through. $81,600 divided into 36 monthly payments is $2,266.67 per month. That first payment hit the account we had set up for it at 9:14 in the morning. I looked at the notification on my phone for a while. My coffee was getting cold on the desk next to me. I thought about my father at his kitchen table on Sunday mornings. I thought about the pencil he handed me and the column I added and the way he tapped the paper when I was wrong. I transferred the payment to Pauline's account at 10:02. I sent her a text that said first payment. Then I put my phone face down and went back to work. She texted back 2 hours later. She said, I got it. Then after a pause, she said, thank you, Renata. I said it was Dad's. She said, I know, thank you anyway. I left my phone face up after that. There is something I want to say about money that I have been thinking about how to say for a long time. Forensic bookkeeping is a field. Built on the premise that money tells a story, every transaction is a sentence, every account is a paragraph, every year of records is a chapter, and like any story, what matters is not just what is there, but what is conspicuously absent, what has been redacted, what is present in one version and gone from another. What my father's ledger told, what the brown-covered ledger with his name underlined twice told, was not just the story of what was taken from him. It told the story of his entire relationship to money, which was his entire relationship to responsibility, which was his entire relationship to the people he loved. Every entry in that ledger was a decision he made about what mattered. Every carefully noted grocery receipt and utility payment and birthday gift was an act of care expressed in numerical form. Dale's transactions were in that ledger too once I had reconstructed them. They sit alongside my father's own entries the way an uninvited guest sits alongside a family at a dinner they were not meant to attend. They are there. They cannot be removed from the record, but they are not the story, they are not the truth of those years. They are what happened in the margins while my father kept doing what he had always done, which was showing up and counting and trying to account for things honestly. I believe my father knew by the end that I would find it. He was not a man who trusted accidentally. When he added my name to the account that January day in 2020, when he handed me the ledger and said you do the math, he was making a choice that was both a request and a transfer of something he had been carrying alone for a long time. He was handing me the pencil. I want to come back to the house one more time, Maple Ridge Drive, the house my parents bought in 1981 for $68,000, which is worth $245,000 on today's market. The house that went through the estate and was listed in November of 2022. I went back one more time before it sold. Pauline and I had already gone through everything, had divided the furniture and the photographs and the accumulated material of a life lived carefully in one place for 40 years. The house was empty when I went back, just walls and floors and the sound of the heating vent and the slow drip of the kitchen faucet. I stood in the kitchen for a while. I stood in my old bedroom. I stood in the doorway of my parents' room and looked at the light coming through the window my mother always kept clean, the one that faced the side yard where she grew tomatoes until she couldn't. I did not cry in the house. I have a bad habit, or maybe it is a good one, of saving the difficult feelings for after, for the car or the kitchen at midnight or the space between sleep and waking when the guard is down. The house was just a house. The people who made it something were gone. I locked the front door and put the key in an envelope for the realtor and drove back to Pittsburgh. 3 months later, it sold for $238,000, slightly under asking. The proceeds went into the estate account and were divided according to the will my father had updated in the fall of 2019. The will was written without Dale's knowledge. That was one of the things I found out later from the estate attorney. My father had gone to see an attorney in Steubenville on his own in October of 2019, 2 months before he called me to borrow $300. He had updated the will to name me as executor and to include specific language about the joint accounts and who had authority over them in the event of his incapacity or death. He had been planning, even then, even before I started looking, he had been preparing the ground for someone to look. I sat with that for a long time when I found out. My father at 78, driving himself to an attorney's office on a Tuesday, probably, because he always did things like that on a Tuesday, sitting across from someone he did not know and explaining his situation in the careful, precise language of a man who has spent a lifetime making sure his records are in order. He could not confront Dale directly. He did not have the evidence in a form that would have done anything except cause a family fracture without resolution, but he could update his will. He could add my name to an account. He could hand me the ledger and say you do the math. He did all three. Gerald A. Holloway, Steubenville, Ohio. He knew what he was doing. He always knew what he was doing. I think about this when I am struggling with a case that is not moving the way it should, when the documents are inconsistent, or the trail goes cold for a while, or the opposing counsel is particularly skilled at obscuring things that I know are there. I think about my father at 78, quietly preparing, not getting to see the ending, trusting that the ending would come anyway. That keeps me sitting at the desk, that keeps me adding the columns. The ledger is on my desk in Pittsburgh, the brown one with his name underlined twice. I have not written anything in it, it would feel wrong to add to it. It is his record, his voice, his life in numbers, and it is complete. But I do open it, Sundays mostly when the apartment is quiet and the light comes in at a certain angle and I am not in a hurry to be anywhere. I open it to a random page and I read the entries. Groceries, November 2014. Car registration, February 2015. Property tax, first installment, 2016. Dottie and Herb dinner, March 2017, $7 for the tip he insisted on leaving even though Herb tried to argue him out of it. A life in numbers, specific and complete and entirely his own. I close it and I go back to my files. My name is Renata June Holloway. My father handed me a pencil when I was small and taught me to find the error in the column and not to stop until I found it. I did not stop. It took longer than it should have, and I will live with that, and I did not stop. The numbers added up the way the numbers always add up when you stay with them long enough. He knew I would find it. He was right. There is a period I skipped over too quickly and I want to go back to it. The period between December of 2020, when I had the complete reconstruction ready, and January of 2021, when my father had his stroke. That is less than 4 weeks and it contains a lot that I have not told you yet. After I told my father the file was complete, after I told him I was ready to move forward, we had one more long Saturday together. It was December 12th. I remember because it was the Saturday of the high school winter concert at Edison, and the street outside his house was full of cars going past toward the school, parents driving kids, kids running in from parking lots with their instrument cases, and through the front window you could see them, and it was the kind of ordinary winter Saturday that does not know it is being remembered. We sat at the table. He had made his coffee and I had my tea, and there was a plate of the shortbread cookies he bought every December from the coffee clatch on Market Street, the ones in the red tin with the plaid bow. He ate two, and I ate several more than that because the shortbread at the coffee clatch is genuinely perfect, and I do not apologize for that. He asked me to walk him through the full reconstruction one more time, all 47 transactions. I had a printed copy, a clean version formatted for legal use. I had brought 3 copies in a folder because I always bring extra copies. We went through it from the beginning. April 2012 to December 2019, he listened to each one. Occasionally he said, I remember that. Occasionally he said, I thought that was the gutter repair. I would say it was listed as gutter repair, but the actual gutter repair was invoiced and paid 6 weeks later through a separate check. You'll see it here. He would say, right, and we would move on. When we finished, he sat for a while with his hands around his cup. He said, what happens now? I told him, Sandra files the civil complaint in March. Discovery takes several months. There will likely be a deposition. If it does not settle, it goes to trial, which takes longer. Best case is a settlement within 18 months, more likely 2 years. He said, and what happens to Pauline? I said, that depends on Dale and what he does when he's served. He said, and what do you think he'll do? I said, I think he'll deny it, and then I think the evidence will make that increasingly difficult to maintain. He said, is the evidence strong enough? I said, yes. He said, you're sure? I said, I am sure. He looked at me for a long time, that brown look, the one I inherited, the one that doesn't give much away. He said, okay. Just okay. He picked up a shortbread cookie and broke it in half and ate one half and set the other down on the plate. He said, I'm sorry this took so long for me to do something about. I said, Dad. He said, I knew something was off for a while. I didn't want to believe it because believing it meant certain things about Pauline's life, and I didn't want that for her. I said, I know. He said, I kept thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was old and confused about the numbers. That's what he made me think, that I was confused. I said, you weren't confused. Your ledger is perfectly accurate. He looked at the ledger, which was sitting closed on the table between us. He said, I know that. He said it quietly, not with satisfaction, not with pride, just as a statement of something that had always been true even through the years of being made to doubt it. I know that. He had always known that. That is what I mean when I say he was precise. About who he was, he did not need me to affirm his accuracy. He needed me to take it seriously, which is a different thing. I drove back to Pittsburgh that Sunday night. I called Sandra on Monday and told her to prepare to file in March. She said she had been ready for weeks. I said I knew and I appreciated it. She said the case was strong. I said I knew that too. My father had his stroke 9 days later. I need to tell you about the morning I got the call, because it changed the shape of what came after in ways I am still understanding. It was a Thursday. I was at my desk by 7:30, which is my habit, coffee and open files before 8. My phone rang at 8:04 and it was a number I didn't recognize and I almost didn't answer because my habit with unknown numbers is to let them go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. It was Marvy Seltzer. She said, "Renata, this is Marvy from next door to your dad. He needs to go to the hospital. I already called the ambulance. I'm with him. He's awake, but he can't move his face right." I said, "I'm leaving right now." She said, "He knew I was calling you. He said okay when I asked if I should." I said, "Thank you, Marvy. Stay with him." She said, "I am." I was in the car in 4 minutes. I drove to Steubenville in an hour and 48 minutes, which is not a time I recommend for that road, but which is what it is. I was at Trinity Medical Center by 10:15. Marvy was in the waiting room. She stood up when she saw me and she handed me a paper bag with a container of soup in it and said, "I didn't know if you'd had breakfast." I had not had breakfast. I ate the soup in the waiting room. It was minestrone. It was extremely good and I was extremely grateful for it. These are the things that stay with you. My father was in a room down the hallway. He was awake. The left side of his face was slack in the way of stroke, the eyelid drooping, the corner of the mouth pulled. His right hand was on the bed rail, and when I walked in, he moved it toward me, and I took it and held it. He said very slowly through the right side of his mouth, "You got here fast." I said I may have broken some laws. Something moved in his face that was almost a smile. I sat in the chair beside his bed for 5 hours. A neurologist came in and explained the situation, the type of stroke, the blood pressure readings, the next steps. She was direct and thorough and did not use softening language that implied there was more to soften, which I appreciated. My father listened with his eyes open, and when she finished, he asked 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them the questions a man asks when he wants information, not reassurance. That evening, when the nurses had settled him for the night and the hallway outside his room had gone quiet and the television was off, and it was just the two of us in the low light, he said, "The file." I said, "It's safe, everything is documented, and with Sandra, the case can proceed." He said, "Okay." I said, "Rest, Dad." He said, "I'm fine." He was not exactly fine, but he was Gerald Holloway from Steubenville, Ohio, and fine was what he said, and I did not argue because some things are more important than accuracy. The 3 weeks he was in the hospital were a specific kind of difficult that I am not sure I have words for. Not dramatic, not crisis in the obvious sense. Just the slow, hard work of sitting with someone you love while they navigate a body that is not working the way it used to, while the world outside keeps moving, while you are holding multiple things at once and trying to hold all of them without dropping any of them. Pauline came every day. We were not talking about the case during that period. We had made a silent agreement, neither of us having said it out loud, that the hospital was not the place for that conversation. She would come in the morning and I would come in the afternoon, and we would overlap for an hour and make small talk, and one of us would go get coffee and the other would sit with Dad, and that was the rhythm. Dale came twice. I was there both times. He sat in the corner chair with his hands on his knees and made conversation with my father in the register of a man performing a visit, and my father responded in the register of a man receiving one, and I sat on the other side of the bed and looked at the window and let the conversation happen around me. The second time Dale came, he looked at me when he thought I was looking out the window, and I was not looking out the window. I was watching his reflection in the glass, and in his reflection I saw his eyes go to my briefcase, which was on the floor beside my chair. Just a glance. Quick, the way you glance at something that you have been thinking about without knowing you have been thinking about it. I did not react. I looked out the window at the actual window view, which was a parking structure and a strip of gray December sky. I let the silence do what silence does when you do not fill it. Dale left after about 20 minutes that second time. My father was tired and said so. Dale said, of course, you rest, Gerald," and he stood up and he said goodbye to me, and I said goodbye to him, and that was the last time I spoke to Dale Rickers before Sandra Cho filed the civil complaint in March of 2021. My father came home from the hospital on January 8th. He was not well, but he was home, and home mattered to him in a way that hospital could not substitute for regardless of how good the care was. I stayed with him through the 15th. I cooked things. I made sure he took the new medications at the right times. I helped him with the exercises the occupational therapist had given him, which he did not want to do but which he did because I sat there with him at the prescribed times, and there was no easy way out of it that did not involve disappointing me. And disappointing me was something my father could not quite bring himself to do when I was in the room. On the 21st, I went back to Pittsburgh. I had to get back to other cases, to the work that was waiting, to the life I had put on pause for a month. I hugged him in the doorway when I left. He was wearing his flannel shirt, the blue one with the dark stripe, and he smelled like his soap and his coffee, and I held on for a second longer than usual. He said, "You've been good to me." I said, "You're my father." He said, "That's not a small thing." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Go on." I went. He died 2 days later, January 23rd, 2021, peacefully, according to the hospice nurse who had been coming every other day. He had gone to sleep and not woken up, which is the version of the ending that his children should probably have been hoping for even when we were hoping for something longer. When I found out, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time, not 12 minutes this time, longer. I do not know how long exactly. I know that by the time I went inside, it was fully dark and I had missed a meeting that I had to apologize for the next day. I called Pauline. I do not remember what I said. I know she cried. I know I did not then, not until later, not until I was in the kitchen at midnight with the lights off and the apartment quiet and the brown ledger on the table in front of me where I had put it. When I came home, I sat with it in the dark for a while. I did not open it, I just sat with it. Then I turned on the light and I opened it to the last entry. It was dated November 14th, 2020, $32.40 for the coffee clutch. December shortbread, he had written in parentheses beside it, early this year. He had bought the shortbread early in November of 2020. He had put it away somewhere in the house. He had written it in the ledger with his careful hand, his name at the front, his life in numbers, and noted that it was early this year as if he needed to account for the variance in timing, as if the record needed to be accurate about when and why. I ate those cookies in December at his table while the high school kids ran past with their instrument cases. He bought them in November, he wrote it down. He knew he was already preparing to be gone by December. Gerald A. Holloway, Steubenville, Ohio. I closed the ledger. I sat in my kitchen until the coffee I had made was cold, and then I made more coffee and I sat some more. I still have the tin the shortbread came in. I kept it. It is on the shelf in my kitchen in Pittsburgh. Red plaid lid, slightly dented on one corner where it got knocked off a shelf at some point. I keep paper clips in it now because I have nowhere else to put them and because having something to do with a tin is better than looking at it empty. I do not need to explain that further. Some things explain themselves. I want to end here or close to here because I have been talking for a long time and I am aware that this story has a lot of grief in it alongside the forensic documentation and the legal proceedings, and I want to be honest about that rather than folding it away. The money mattered. The truth mattered. The legal outcome mattered and was worth every hour I put into it. But underneath all of that is just a woman sitting at her father's table learning to add columns, learning patience, learning that accuracy is a form of love, learning that the truth of a thing is worth preserving even when preserving it is slow and difficult, and the people you most want to tell it to are no longer there to hear it. My father taught me the pencil, I taught the columns, he handed me the ledger, I did the math. The math was right. It was always right.